Thanks to Deep Talks, Danny and Pepe, of course, for making this space. I went to the last event and I really thought that these two were like the modern Gertrude Steins. They're curating these groups of like beautiful, brilliant people pushing culture forward. So I'm really grateful to be here to share my story because I really do think it's an important topic, and I always speak about business instead. So this is kind of like a coming out party for me, and all of you are here, so thanks for sharing this. I have some slides prepared, but I think the objective tonight is to talk about mental health and mental illness and address what stigmas might be affecting our lives every day. Whew. So to do it, I've selected a few stories that I think will add context and a framework for us. The first is actually back in 1997 when I was 8 years old. I was getting ready to watch the movie Street Fighter with my family. So here I am, 1997. And if you are unfamiliar with the movie Street Fighter, by the way, and here's my family, it's based on a video game. It has a really thin plot, like loose on the plot, but tons of action. So I was really, really excited and into this concept, also because my childhood hero was a star, Jean-Claude Van Damme. So much so that my friends and I would go to the playground, we would practice doing the splits, we would do like fake kung fu with each other. So during the movie, I was as close to the TV as possible, and my mom always policed. She was like, no, you're gonna ruin your eyes. But she didn't feel so well, so she went upstairs to rest. And so my dad started policing me, and I was like, oh, well, she's gone. I can just like get up front. But he would like literally drag me back, and I would scoop up, and then he would drag me back until the movie ended. And I was so excited to tell my mom that my sister Jill and I, we ran upstairs to tell her, but we found her unconscious on the floor. And it turns out she had an aneurysm during the movie and passed away. My dad, and we'll go into Asian American culture as well, but he's a very stoic person, and he was stunned. So I remembered, what should we do? Call 911. I picked up the phone and I called 911, and my sister, 13 at the time, she had just finished her swim lessons, and part of it is learning CPR. So she was attempting CPR to resuscitate my mom. And I was on the phone with the dispatcher. They were still 10 minutes away or more. I kept asking them, like, why can't you come faster? I don't understand. So the CPR wasn't working. She started coaching my dad through it instead, but even that wasn't working. Eventually, we were at the hospital waiting to be briefed by the attending. And if you know me, I'm a very impatient person. I was even more impatient at that time, like a little kid. And I ran through the hospital because I wanted answers. I found a doctor and grabbed his coat. He was like probably looking around, doesn't even know who's grabbing his coat. And I wiped my tears and demanded answers. But what would I know about medicine as an 8-year-old? So I asked the only question I knew how to ask, and with his coat in my hands, I was like, my mom's dying. Is it because of germs? And he gave me this heartbroken look, very teetering on the edge of like sympathy and empathy. And I bring that up because every time I visit my mom, I actually think of this. I think of that look and I picture it in my head. And that moment and that whole event was immediately imprinted on my identity. So we talked about Alex. Alex is a phenomenal speaker and filmmaker, and he talked about identity. This is a little bit of continuation of that. I think that with mental health and with everything that's going along in our political and economical system today, identity permeates age, race, sexuality. But tonight I want to focus it on mental illness itself and on my disorder, bipolar disorder, because it exists for the most part as a dichotomy. So I'm sharing stories from my personal life that don't necessarily reflect the entire bipolar community, nor does it reflect necessarily everyone who is seeking help with their mental illness. But that's the context and the framework. So this was imprinted on me immediately. I went back to the 3rd grade and I was a kid without a mom. Same thing with my family. My dad was immediately associated with the term widowed. And that sister who was trying to do CPR, she's now one of the leading physicians at Northwestern Children's Hospital. So it all affected us in some way, shape, or form. And that was also my first time planning a funeral. As an 8-year-old, I didn't have that much of a say, but I do remember my family bickering endlessly about how we should represent my mom. Because at that time, when you're planning a funeral, you decide how to remember someone. More importantly, you decide how to present that person at the funeral, at the wake. And we disagreed because one of my sisters grew up with my mom and remembered that she had these drastic mood swings. She was irritable. She would be happy one moment, and the other moment, like we would just be running out of the house. There's a very visceral memory where she was chasing my dad around with a butcher knife. And we'll get more into that later. But I mentioned that also because my other sister, she only wanted to remember the fun things. My mom was really kind. She was really generous to everyone in the neighborhood. We had this community garden. We gave it and gave the produce around. So we have these two sides, and in reflection, I started thinking about, well, she worked her whole life to build an identity for herself. And at this point, she's only influencing the identity that's being presented at her funeral and her wake. So there's this dichotomy there. There's an individual and a self-identity as well as the social perception of the identity. All of us here, again, deal with this in one shape, size, form, because we're all unique individuals, especially living in the turmoil of New York. Especially living in this turmoil of New York. So I speak everywhere, like Danny was saying, and I have spent so many years crafting a brand persona. If any of you are in here in marketing, this must resonate with you. I get up in front of people to talk about business in front of a class, and I say, I do marketing at Kickstarter. I teach marketing at NYU. This is my credibility slide. But over the last few years, I've become increasingly upset with the mental health depictions in popular culture, in the news. There's one in particular recently, the Netflix show 13 Reasons Why. And I understand there's correlations all over the place, so I'm not trying to generalize too much. But this was a teenager who was portrayed as having a mental illness. And what really got me is that there wasn't an explanation of how to healthily cope with mental illness. It was very much a one-sided story, and to me, it's sensationalist. It was great for ratings. It was great for their storytelling. And with gun violence as well. This is where I've noticed a lot. With certain politicians, they are advocating for gun laws by pointing fingers at specific mental illnesses. Again, correlations here, I get that. But an individual isn't represented by a single mental illness or a single type of mental illness. And with all of these thoughts today, I'm just tired of sensationalist headlines driving adolescents in their education of mental health. I'm also tired of having these organizations valuing their ratings more than the common good. So in the last just couple weeks, I decided I speak about business because I can, but I'm speaking now about mental health because I should. So I was diagnosed with bipolar I disorder when I was 18 in 2007. It was around the time that I was also hospitalized for an addiction to self-injury. So if you are unfamiliar with this, bipolar disorder is a manic depressive illness. It has both highs and lows, and it's a dichotomy because it is paired with the high of manic episodes as well as a low as depressive episodes. When I was first diagnosed, I had an amazing psychiatrist, and he put it pretty simply, which made a lot of sense to me, and that's people overall can experience emotions from 0 to 10. And the average person generally experiences 4 to 7. And if you suffer from depression, you might experience a 2 or a 1. If you suffer from something that's a little more obsessive compulsive or ADHD, you'll experience an 8 or a 9. And when he was diagnosing me, he's like, you experience a 0 and a 10. Everything along the spectrum. So that's one main difference between bipolar disorder as well in relationship to other types of mental illness. And that made a lot of sense to me, and I was really trying to figure out what that meant for me. So here's the clinical definition of a manic episode, meaning it lasts for more than 1 week and you experience at least 3 of these. What I'd like you to do, if you can see the screen, take a second and count the number of these that you have individually experienced. And then when you're ready, just put hands up with the amount that you have experienced. saw a 7, another 7, a 3. All right, this is about what I expected around here. The point is that none of these are like, oh, if you can't sleep, you must be bipolar. So why are these characterized for a manic episode, and how is that different than what all of us in here feel every day, especially the distractibility part? Look at Instagram, like Snapchat nowadays. Let me give you a couple concrete examples. When I experience a manic episode and we get closer to the 10, I can't escape it. So that's one specific part of it. We can cope and it gets a little bit better, we as a community. And when I was in high school, there's one memory, especially after I had spiraled after weeks being in this manic episode. I had this period of elation, self-esteem, and I thought I could fly. It was the middle of the night, I was in high school, I really thought I could fly, so I opened my window and I jumped out. And immediately realized I can't fly. And so think of that, that's the 10 for me. I'm like, I am a superhero. Whereas it's episodic and it's bipolar, so this dichotomy. So now imagine that same feeling, but the equal for the depression. When I was in high school, I spent a lot of time on suicide prevention hotlines. I dialed them a whole bunch. It was like the majority of my phone bill most times. And that's what it looks like for me. When I realize I'm slipping and I am unable to cope or prevent it, I experience that elation and then eventually experience the depression. And oftentimes they are equals, the 10 and the 0, the 9 and the 2, and so forth. So I'd also mention that I'm bipolar 1. Here's like an oversimplification I made. It's a little chart where the main difference between bipolar 1 and bipolar 2, the two types, is the severity of the mania. So people who are diagnosed as bipolar 2, the main difference is that they don't experience the most severe mania, which requires them to be removed from work or social situations. I was hospitalized, and I've been removed from work situations before as well, like longer history. So that is why I was diagnosed with bipolar 1. Majority of the population that lives with bipolar disorder in the US, there's 5.7 million people currently diagnosed. Those people live with bipolar 2, and thank God less of them fewer live with bipolar 1. But it's okay. So when I slip, it's frightening, it's absolutely frightening, because at this point, knowing the triggers, knowing the coping mechanisms, when it happens, it's because I just didn't notice. And then it's too late. And at that point, the only solution is to limit the severity and to try and slip out of it as quickly as possible. And at this point, I know, all right, maybe I'm not going to go out tonight, or maybe I should go out tonight. And there's a whole bunch of different treatments that we can practice. Bipolar disorder itself is not curable. It's a chemical disorder, and it's a chemical illness. However, it's highly treatable. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to talk tonight, because these stigmas, I think, are preventing people from seeking help. And this is a little bit preaching to the choir. By virtue of being here, you're probably not the people stigmatizing as much. So I do have an activity for us to do together to think through it and then be those agents of change. So when I slip, it feels more like this. It's less linear. And it's in and it's out, and trying this coping mechanism, trying that one, and some of them work, some of them don't, and every case is different. So that's what it's like living with bipolar disorder. I eventually started coping, though, before I knew I was bipolar, with self-injury. It started when I was in 5th grade. A teacher sent me home because I was using a pencil to make designs in my hand. And that's when I started experimenting with it. And when conducting research for this talk, I stumbled upon this statistic, which was just horrifying to me. I thought it was way less than this. And I also started reading more about how self-injury is depicted in popular culture. I think that there's two misconceptions that we should know about. One is that it's not purely masochistic in perception, and secondly, it's not to see the blood. In my case, I have a history of cutting and burning. There are other types of self-injury where it's bone breaking, it's contusions. Mine is pretty contained to that. And it started off because I saw it in 7th Heaven. I saw it on a TV show, and I was feeling really bad, so I just tried it. And it wasn't until years after that that I became addicted. And here's where that misconception comes into play. Because when one person becomes addicted to self-injury, the most common reason is because your body releases endorphins upon injury. And the endorphin rush helped me feel numb during those times. So that was the actual addiction, but it started because I was like, what do I do at this point? I saw this thing on TV and let me just try it. All right, great. So that's how I started with it, and shit really hit the fan when I was 17, and I went to my best friend's party. This is her there. I went to her house party, and she found me injuring myself in her bathroom. She immediately called her dad, who's a doctor, and he came in and like bandaged me, and then another friend drove me to the hospital. But because I was 17 and a minor at the time, we had to call my dad and my sister, my legal guardians, and they came to pick me up. So I was so frightened, like legit frightened of what my dad would do and say because of how he grew up. And there's something to know about my dad is, by the way, that's him my age. So he grew up in an impoverished part of Taiwan. So impoverished that he was actually on a government assistance program where they crushed a multivitamin into his family's rice once a week to prevent like scurvy, things that we don't experience here. And he eventually joined the army and then got a full ride to Texas A&M, American University. So he worked so hard and persevered to get to the place he is. And we got to Texas in the 60s. He worked at a gas station to pay for college. And he would get harassed constantly. Barely knew English. It was definitely a different time then. And he would tell me stories where people would light his house on fire at least once a week and write racial slurs and then harass and assault him in public. So with all of this stuff, it really shaped his opinion on mental health as well as American culture. We never talked about mental health growing up. Like, we still don't. My dad does not think of the challenges his kids go through or the people he sees around him as like big enough challenges. He's like, look what happened to me. And even further, so he's entering the hospital and he sees that I'm on a gurney, I'm in a hospital bed. And essentially what goes through his head is, my son is stronger than being injured or injuring himself. There's nothing in American culture that he has dealt with that is harder than what I have dealt with. So he signed me out. He drove separately with my sister. My sister was living downtown at the time. He signed me out. We walked out together. My head was just like, oh God, what is he gonna say? And he said this, which translates to, your mom would be ashamed. And he drove off. So my sister had to drive me home that night. And this is the first time I assessed my own identity. I hadn't really thought about it before because I was like, I play soccer, I play a musical instrument, like I'm going to Stanford. Like that was all I really thought about. And at this point now, I'm like, who does my mom want me to be? Why would she be ashamed? Why is my dad acting this way? And it was the first point of many over the next few months where I started building my self-identity till where we are today. Oh, yes. So, my school found out because legally the hospital has to tell me school, and they decided that I cannot attend school until I finished a rehabilitation program. And they called me, I went to school the next day, they called me into the office, they were like, Jonathan Chang, please come to the office. And I went down 8th period. I arrived, it was my guidance counselor and police officers. And I was like, okay, so I kind of get what's happening here. And their proposed solution to get me to the hospital was to handcuff me to a gurney and then put a bag over my head and then carry me out. So I politely said no. You know the slide. So I was like, okay, so no, let's not do that. And they wheeled me out anyway, and to my horror, I saw that they moved all of the school buses and all the 3,000 students who were waiting for the school buses to drive the ambulance onto the grass. And they wheeled me past every single student. It was like the Red Sea, legit. It was like the Red Sea of students. And then into the ambulance. And at that time, I felt my identity slipping out of my hands and into the hands of 3,000 high school students. Thinking about all the rumors that would happen, thinking about what they thought of me now, it was so tough. So what happened next was experiences in a rehabilitation clinic and really systemic failures in our mental health system. I experienced overcrowding. I experienced overworked social workers and a system that wasn't structured properly to help people dealing with multiple illnesses or living with multiple illnesses cope and become better. I do agree with the premise of the program, though. The premise of the program is that it's a safe place for people to be triggered and then learn healthy coping mechanisms. However, because the program was so overcrowded, we would go into these small group sessions to be triggered and then left completely raw. And that's a feeling that's different than depression, or at least how I feel bipolar disorder, is that I hear about depression as it's heavy, whereas bipolar disorder to me is raw. It's this raw nerve and everything is sensitive. Over so many years, I've been mean to people. I've been irritable, I've been aggressive, and it's not because of this disorder, but it's because I was so sensitive and didn't know how to cope, and I wasn't talking to anyone at school, and I wasn't talking to anyone at home about this. I was watching Seventh Heaven and being like, this is how I should live my life. Great. So in this program, people of all different ages, ethnicities, mine specifically with a self-injury recovery. In addition to that, we had children's self-injury, there was eating disorders, and a slew of others as well. We would see them all in the cafeteria, just kind of like eating in their groups. It was like a really weird version of that scene in Mean Girls where they're looking around. I was lost in the system though, literally lost in the computer scheduling system. I met with a psychiatrist once during the entire time, but I kept being prescribed new medications because the social workers would give their reports to the psychiatrist and the psychiatrist would then write me prescriptions and I would take the medications. And I was now I know, not a great situation, but I was originally diagnosed with severe depression. If you know anything about bipolar disorder and the medication associated with it, is that an antidepressant is actually dangerous for people who live with bipolar disorder because it triggers manic episodes. So I was in this place on a very heavy dose of antidepressants, and I remember very distinctly this one small group where one of the social workers, she was a social worker in training, I'd actually seen her crying in the hallway twice before this. She had a really hard time. They were thrown into this failing system. So, right after she cried in this group, and I went last, there were 5 of us, and it was like, okay, let's talk about living in the foster system for you, let's talk about stress as a consultant for you, and by the time they got to me, I don't know why she said this, but she told me that your mom died because you didn't catch it in time. And time was up. So I was on the antidepressants and very triggered, and then I went down. I mean, as down as the drugs would allow me to go. And that night, I took a plastic fork and I cut the words fuck up into myself. And I think that was a really eye-opening experience because they kept telling us, fake it till you make it, fake it till you make it. But I think a big part of what was missing was fake it until you become it. And I'm really hoping that's the next slide. Yes. Well, fake it until you become it. So there's this Harvard professor who talks about this entire concept, and it's like that saying is half done. So I ended up going back, and we gamed the system essentially. There was a group of us who were going through the program together, and we were like, okay, well, let's go to art therapy and just use neon colors. So we did that. And they're like, oh, it looks like you're getting so much better. Who knows if they thought we were getting better, but they didn't have time to work with us. So we were looking at individual signs of recovery. So we played with that. We made all the signs of recovery, and I was released 2 weeks later. But there were good times as well. There's one in particular, I'm just going to say Kayla. because I don't want to say her real name. She was my age at the time, and she spent the majority of her pregnancy in the hospital. And she was part of both the injury program as well as the eating disorders program. Bringing that up specifically because I think that her time was elongated since she wasn't able to use community as a way of healing. She was part in our program, part in their program, and there's such high turnover since we're like, great, signs of recovery, get out. That I think that it was much harder for her to find these allies within and then heal together. But on the day she was released, it was soon after her birthday. Her goal was to eat birthday cake on her birthday. And the social workers all got together, they baked her a cake, brought it in, and we all ate it and cried together. It was beautiful. And that brings me to this quote. I read a lot of Wendell Berry in college, but it really made me think that even in a fractured system, a small, devoted community, or you can still build a community for healing. I go back to this quote a lot. If you're into farming, Wendell Berry is a phenomenal author. And that was my experience in the hospital. So that brings me to an exercise I want us all to do together. Those are my stories for framing everything. There's this idea I've had called radical introspection. Don't know if it's a real thing, but I'm trying to coin it. It's actually made for people, I'm really characterizing and generalizing who you are, who may reinforce mental illness stigmas unintentionally. So that's the group it's for. So this whole idea of radical introspection, it actually came about when I was learning the language of Mandarin. I grew up with it as my first language and then forgot about it because I was like a brat as a kid. And then I studied it again during college, and I realized I was using these two words improperly. One is hui, and the other one is kui. One means to be able, and the other one means to be allowed or can. So unlike the way that Americans use the word can interchangeably, these are very strict. So I bring this up because I, over time, have understood my triggers, my coping mechanisms, and I am able to be healthy and I am able to be treated. However, at times, I don't feel like I can talk about my disorder, and I don't feel like I can talk about what I'm going through, even if I feel like I'm starting to be triggered because of, one, perhaps people immediately around who don't understand or wouldn't understand, and secondly, this permeating feeling and understanding that what is represented on social media and popular culture is greater than the people who are immediately around me. And it's something logically, it's like, oh man, that's just Twitter. But when you're in it, it feels like it's so much heavier. It feels like it's an entire blanket. So the idea is allowing people to seek treatment by being a little more cognizant and cautious of the ways that we address conflict. I don't know if you know this, but New York State actually has a $75,000 annual mental illness anti-stigma fund, and these are the organization in New York City that received the fund in 2017. So if you want to get involved or if you want to get a little more educated about it, these three organizations are working on this at this moment. The work has not been surfaced yet, but we can also hold them accountable. That could be the other part of this. So here's what I want you to do. I would like everyone to take 3 Post-it notes and a pen, and I want you to think about the last conflict you were part of. So like emotional conflict, and write 3 individual reasons why the conflict occurred. 1 on each Post-it note. Afterwards, I'm going to give you the second half of the instructions. It's super ambiguous prompt for a reason. We are going to stick them on these boards, so Post-its would be preferred. Thanks. Does anyone here have nails? Thanks.
So when we say thing we have to write is the reasons why, right?
Yes.